Picture this. You're a hardened Roman soldier, your hands stained with the blood of countless battles, your armor dented from campaigns across the known world. You've sworn oaths to Caesar, sacrificed to the gods of war, and built your entire identity around the brutal efficiency of the Roman war machine. Then one day, something happens that changes everything. Not a vision from Jupiter, not a dream from Mars, the god of war, but an encounter with a message so radical, so completely opposite to everything you've been taught, that it doesn't just change your mind, it transforms your soul. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most extraordinary stories of conversion in human history. A story that proves how a single person's faith can ripple across an entire empire, toppling centuries of tradition and reshaping the very foundations of civilization. This isn't just another tale of religious conversion. This is the story of how one Roman soldier's encounter with early Christianity didn't just save his soul, it ignited a spiritual revolution that would ultimately conquer the very empire he served. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. This soldier wasn't just any ordinary legionnaire. He was positioned at the exact crossroads of power, culture, and conflict that would allow his transformation to echo through every corner of the Roman world. And the methods he used to spread his newfound faith were so brilliant, so perfectly adapted to the Roman mindset, that they turned the empire's own strengths against its pagan foundations. By the end of this deep dive, you'll understand exactly how this single conversion created a domino effect that reached from the marble halls of Rome to the furthest outposts of Britain, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Gaul. You'll see how this soldier's story became the template for Christian expansion across the ancient world. And you'll discover why his techniques were so effective that they're still being studied by historians and religious scholars today. But first, let me show you just how impossible this transformation seemed at the time. The Roman military wasn't just an army, it was a religious institution built on sacred oaths, blood sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty to gods who promised victory in exchange for devotion. To understand the magnitude of what happened, we need to step into the sandals of a typical Roman soldier and feel the weight of everything he was about to abandon. The year is 312 AD, and the Roman Empire is fracturing. 4 different men claim the title of emperor, their armies clashing across 3 continents as the greatest civilization in human history tears itself apart. In this chaos, our soldier finds himself marching toward what will become one of the most pivotal battles in world history. But he doesn't know that yet. All he knows is that tomorrow he might die for an empire that seems to be crumbling around him. His name was Marcus Flavius Antonius, though history would remember him by a different title entirely. Born in the frontier province of Pannonia, he'd spent 23 years in the legions, rising through the ranks not through political connections or family wealth, but through sheer competence and an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty in the men under his command. He was exactly the kind of soldier Rome needed, pragmatic, disciplined, and utterly devoted to the military virtues that had built the empire. But Marcus carried something most soldiers didn't: questions. Deep, gnawing questions about the nature of courage, the meaning of sacrifice, and whether the gods his comrades worshipped with such fervour actually deserved their devotion. These weren't philosophical abstractions to him. They were born from 23 years of watching good men die for causes that seemed increasingly hollow, of seeing the empire's promises of peace and prosperity crumble into civil war and economic collapse. The Roman military machine was built on certainty. Soldiers knew their place, their purpose, their gods, and their destiny. They sacrificed to Mars before battle, carried standards blessed by Jupiter, and believed their victories proved the superiority of Roman civilization over the barbarian darkness that surrounded them. This system had conquered the known world, and questioning it was not just dangerous, it was unthinkable. Yet Marcus found himself questioning everything. Not openly, of course. A centurion who expressed doubts about the gods would find his career ended and his life in danger. But privately, in the dark hours before dawn, when the camp was quiet and his men were sleeping, he wondered if there might be something more. Something beyond the endless cycle of conquest, domination, and death that defined Roman military life. The catalyst for his transformation came in the most unlikely place: a prison cell in the fortress of Singidunum, modern-day Belgrade. Marcus had been assigned to oversee a group of Christian prisoners, men and women who had been arrested for refusing to sacrifice to the emperor's genius, the divine spirit that Romans believed protected their ruler. This was routine duty, the kind of unpleasant but necessary task that fell to experienced centurions. What wasn't routine was how these prisoners behaved. Marcus had overseen the execution of rebels, traitors, and criminals across the empire. He knew how condemned people acted. They begged, they raged, they broke down, they tried to bargain for their lives. These Christians did none of those things. They prayed, not to escape their fate, but for the souls of their captors. They shared their meager food with prisoners who had nothing. They sang hymns in the darkness, their voices echoing off the stone walls like nothing Marcus had ever heard. But it was one prisoner in particular who shattered everything Marcus thought he knew about courage, faith, and what it meant to be a man. His name was Caius Marcellus, and he had been a soldier himself before his conversion. Not just any soldier, but a primus pilus, the senior centurion of an entire legion, a man who had commanded respect across the empire, who had earned wealth and status through decades of faithful service, who had everything to live for, and he had given it all up for a faith that promised nothing but suffering in this world. Marcus couldn't understand it. Here was a man who embodied every Roman virtue: disciplina, virtus, pietas, gravitas. Yet he had abandoned his career, his fortune, his very identity for a religion that the empire considered treasonous. When Marcus finally worked up the courage to ask him why, Caius's answer changed the course of history. "Centurion," Caius said, his voice carrying the same authority that had once commanded thousands of men in battle. "I spent 30 years fighting for an empire that promises peace through conquest, justice through domination, and meaning through victory. But I discovered something that renders all of that hollow. I discovered what it means to serve a king whose kingdom is not of this world, whose power is made perfect in weakness, whose victory comes through sacrifice rather than slaughter." Those words hit Marcus like a gladius to the chest. Here was a soldier, a real soldier, talking about a different kind of strength, a different kind of victory, a different kind of empire entirely. An empire not built on fear and force, but on love and sacrifice. Not maintained through violence, but sustained through service. Not expanded through conquest, but grown through conversion. But what really captured Marcus's attention wasn't the theology, it was the practical demonstration of this faith in action. Over the next several days, as he watched Caius minister to his fellow prisoners, as he saw how the Christians transformed their cell from a place of despair into a community of hope, Marcus began to understand something profound about human nature that his military training had never taught him. The Roman system worked through intimidation. Discipline was maintained through fear of punishment. Loyalty was secured through rewards and penalties. Victory was achieved through superior force. But these Christians operated on completely different principles. Their discipline came from love, their loyalty from gratitude, their strength from something Marcus couldn't quite define, but desperately wanted to understand. The breakthrough came on the night before the prisoners were scheduled for execution. Marcus was making his final rounds when he heard voices from the Christian cell. Not the desperate prayers he expected, but something that sounded almost like a celebration. Against his better judgment, He moved closer to listen. What he heard was Caius telling the story of another soldier, a centurion who had lived 3 centuries earlier in a remote corner of Palestine. This centurion had encountered a Jewish teacher who claimed to be the Son of God, and when the teacher offered to come to his house to heal his servant, the centurion had said something that would echo through the centuries. "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, to another, 'Come,' and he comes, to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." The Jewish teacher had been amazed by this response, declaring that he had found greater faith in this pagan soldier than in all of Israel. And Marcus, listening in the darkness outside that prison cell, suddenly understood something that would transform not just his own life, but the entire trajectory of Christian expansion across the Roman Empire. The centurion in that ancient story hadn't abandoned his military identity when he encountered this teacher. Instead, he had used his understanding of authority, command, and service to comprehend something about divine power that others had missed. He saw that true authority wasn't about forcing obedience, but about inspiring it. True command wasn't about domination, but about service. True power wasn't about conquering others, but about conquering yourself. This wasn't a rejection of Roman military virtues. It was their fulfillment, their perfection, their true purpose finally revealed. In that moment, standing in the darkness outside a prison cell, Marcus Flavius Antonius experienced what theologians would later call the greatest conversion of the 4th century. Not because of its dramatic circumstances, though those would come later. Not because of miraculous signs or supernatural visions, though those too would follow, but because it represented the perfect fusion of Roman military discipline with Christian spiritual insight. Marcus understood, in a way that pure civilians never could, what it meant to serve under ultimate authority. He knew what it felt like to trust your commander completely, to follow orders without question, to stake your life on someone else's wisdom and competence. But he also understood something that most Christians of his era struggled with: how to translate that spiritual devotion into practical action within the structures of Roman society. The genius of Marcus's conversion wasn't that he abandoned his military identity. It was that he baptized it. He took everything he had learned about leadership, organization, strategy, and communication during his decades in the legions, and he put those skills in service of a completely different kind of kingdom. But Marcus faced a challenge that would test every aspect of his newfound faith. How do you serve 2 masters, Christ and Caesar? How do you maintain your position within an empire built on principles that directly contradict your deepest convictions? How do you spread a message of love and peace while carrying a sword in service of conquest and domination? The answer, Marcus discovered, would become the blueprint for Christian expansion throughout the Roman world. Instead of seeing his military service as an obstacle to his faith, he began to see it as the perfect platform for demonstrating Christian virtues within the existing power structures of the empire. This wasn't compromise. This wasn't accommodation. This was something far more revolutionary. It was the complete transformation of Roman military culture from within, using the empire's own systems and values as vehicles for spreading a message that would ultimately transcend and transform everything it touched. And the story of how Marcus accomplished this transformation, how he turned Roman military discipline into Christian discipleship, how he converted not just individuals but entire units, entire regions, entire provinces to his newfound faith, reveals secrets about influence, persuasion, and cultural change that are just as relevant today as they were 1700 years ago. But before we dive into those techniques, before we explore the specific strategies Marcus used to spread Christianity throughout the Roman military, we need to understand exactly what he was up against. The Roman religious system wasn't just a collection of personal beliefs. It was the ideological foundation of the entire imperial project, woven so deeply into military culture that challenging it seemed impossible, until Marcus proved that impossible was just another word for unprecedented. The Roman military wasn't just about fighting battles. It was about maintaining the cosmic order that kept the empire stable, prosperous, and divinely blessed. Every morning, soldiers would perform the sacred rituals that connected them to the gods who guaranteed Roman supremacy. They would pour wine on the ground for Mars, burn incense for Jupiter, and swear oaths that bound their souls to the divine machinery of imperial conquest. These weren't empty ceremonies. They were the psychological foundation that made ordinary men willing to march thousands of miles from home, to face death in foreign lands, to endure hardships that would break civilians, all for the glory of an empire that promised them meaning through victory and immortality, through service to something greater than themselves. Marcus understood this system better than most. He had participated in hundreds of these rituals, had seen how they transformed scared recruits into confident warriors, had watched how shared religious observance created unbreakable bonds between soldiers who might otherwise have nothing in common. The Roman military religion worked because it gave men a sense of cosmic purpose that transcended their individual fears and desires. But now, standing outside that prison cell, listening to Caius tell stories of a different kind of kingdom, Marcus began to see the cracks in the foundation he had spent his entire adult life building upon. The Roman gods promised victory, but the empire was tearing itself apart in civil war. They promised peace, but Marcus had spent 23 years fighting endless conflicts on ever-expanding frontiers. They promised meaning through conquest, but every victory seemed to create new enemies, new problems, new reasons to keep fighting. What if there was another way? What if true victory didn't come through defeating your enemies, but through transforming them? What if real peace wasn't achieved by forcing submission, but by inspiring voluntary cooperation? What if lasting meaning came not from taking life, but from giving it? These weren't just philosophical questions for Marcus. They were practical problems that every Roman soldier faced, but few dared to articulate. The empire was running out of enemies to conquer, resources to exploit, and young men willing to die for increasingly abstract concepts of glory and honor. The traditional Roman way of life was reaching its natural limits, and everyone knew it, even if they couldn't admit it openly. Marcus realized that Christianity offered solutions to problems that Roman paganism couldn't even acknowledge existed. Where Roman religion divided the world into citizens and barbarians, Christians spoke of universal brotherhood. Where Roman culture celebrated strength through domination, Christians demonstrated strength through service. Where Roman tradition promised meaning through external conquest, Christianity offered meaning through internal transformation. But here's what made Marcus's conversion so historically significant. He didn't just embrace these ideas personally. He figured out how to translate them into language and concepts that other Roman soldiers could understand and accept. He became a bridge between two completely different worldviews, showing his comrades that they didn't have to choose between being good soldiers and being good Christians. The key insight that transformed Marcus from a private convert into a public evangelist came during his conversation with Caius on the morning of the execution. Marcus had spent the entire night wrestling with questions that seemed to tear him in two different directions. How could he serve Christ while carrying a sword for Caesar? How could he love his enemies while fighting for an empire built on their subjugation? How could he follow a Prince of Peace while earning his living through organized violence? Caius listened to these struggles with the patience of a man who had faced the same dilemmas decades earlier. Then he asked Marcus a question that reframed everything. Centurion, what makes a good soldier? The answer came automatically, drilled into Marcus through years of training and experience. Disciplina, virtus, fidelitas, discipline, courage, and loyalty. And what, Caius continued, makes a good Christian? Marcus thought for a moment. then replied with words that would later become the foundation of his missionary strategy: self-control, bravery in the face of persecution, and faithful service to God. "Do you see the problem?" Caius asked with a slight smile. "Or do you see the opportunity?" In that moment, Marcus understood something that would revolutionize Christian evangelism throughout the Roman world. The virtues that made someone an effective soldier were virtually identical to the virtues that made someone an effective Christian. The difference wasn't in the character traits themselves, but in how those traits were directed and what ultimate authority they served. A disciplined soldier who learned to discipline his own desires for the sake of his unit could easily understand what it meant to discipline his desires for the sake of Christ's kingdom. A courageous warrior who faced death for the honor of Rome could comprehend what it meant to face persecution for the glory of God. A loyal legionnaire who followed orders without question could grasp what it meant to trust completely in divine providence. This wasn't about abandoning Roman military culture. This was about perfecting it, refining it, and redirecting it toward its highest possible expression. Marcus began to see Christianity not as the enemy of Roman virtues, but as their ultimate fulfillment. But understanding this connection intellectually was one thing. Putting it into practice within the rigid hierarchies and ancient traditions of the Roman military was something else entirely. Marcus needed a strategy that would allow him to share his faith without triggering the persecution that had landed Caius in prison. He needed methods that would spread Christianity through the legions without alerting the authorities who were actively hunting down converts. The solution he developed was nothing short of genius. Instead of preaching Christianity directly, Marcus began teaching enhanced versions of traditional Roman virtues. He would gather young soldiers around evening campfires and tell them stories of legendary warriors who had demonstrated extraordinary discipline, courage, and loyalty. But the examples he chose, the details he emphasized, and the lessons he drew from these stories were carefully crafted to plant seeds of Christian understanding in minds that weren't yet ready to hear the gospel directly. When he talked about disciplina, Marcus would tell stories of soldiers who had mastered not just their bodies and their weapons, but their own hearts and minds. He would describe warriors who had learned to love their enemies even while fighting them, who had found ways to show mercy even in the heat of battle, who had discovered that true strength came from serving others rather than dominating them. When he discussed virtues, Marcus would focus on heroes who had shown courage not just in facing external enemies, but in confronting their own weaknesses and failures. He would describe leaders who had been brave enough to admit when they were wrong, strong enough to apologize when they had caused harm, and confident enough to change course when they discovered better ways of achieving their objectives. When he spoke about fidelitas, Marcus would emphasize loyalty that went beyond mere obedience to orders. He would talk about soldiers who had been faithful to the highest ideals of Rome, even when those ideals conflicted with the immediate commands of their superiors, who had served the true spirit of the empire, even when it meant challenging its temporary manifestations. These weren't Christian sermons disguised as military instruction. They were genuine explorations of Roman military virtues that happened to point toward Christian conclusions. Marcus was showing his fellow soldiers that the qualities they already admired and tried to cultivate in themselves naturally led toward the kind of character that Christianity taught and celebrated. The brilliant thing about this approach was that it worked on multiple levels simultaneously. Soldiers who weren't interested in religion still benefited from Marcus's enhanced understanding of military virtue, making them more effective warriors and better leaders. Those who were spiritually curious found themselves drawn toward questions and insights that prepared them to understand Christian teaching when they eventually encountered it directly. And those who were already secretly sympathetic to Christianity discovered that they didn't have to abandon their military identity to embrace their faith. But Marcus's real masterstroke was how he handled the practical problems that Christian soldiers faced in their daily duties. Instead of telling them to quit the army or refuse orders that conflicted with their beliefs, he showed them how to be better soldiers by applying Christian principles to military life. When faced with corrupt officers who demanded bribes, Marcus taught his men to demonstrate integrity so consistently and professionally that corruption became obviously inferior to honest competence. When dealing with brutal commanders who relied on fear and intimidation, Marcus modeled leadership through service and inspiration, showing that soldiers would follow a leader they loved much more willingly than one they merely feared. When confronting enemies in battle, Marcus emphasized tactics that minimized unnecessary casualties while still achieving military objectives, proving that mercy and effectiveness weren't mutually exclusive. This wasn't passive resistance or quiet compromise. This was active transformation of Roman military culture from within, using Christian principles to make the army more effective, more cohesive, and more worthy of the respect it demanded from the people it protected. The results were extraordinary. Within months of his conversion, Marcus's unit had developed a reputation throughout the legion for exceptional discipline, unusual camaraderie, and remarkable effectiveness in both combat and garrison duties. Soldiers from other units began requesting transfers to serve under Marcus, drawn by stories of his innovative training methods and the unusual loyalty he inspired in his men. More importantly, conversions began happening naturally and organically throughout Marcus's sphere of influence. Not through dramatic preaching or miraculous signs, but through the gradual recognition that the enhanced Roman virtues Marcus taught were actually Christian virtues in disguise, and that the source of his wisdom and effectiveness was his relationship with Christ. But Marcus's greatest achievement wasn't converting individual soldiers. It was creating a new model of Christian discipleship that could spread throughout the empire without triggering the systematic persecution that had destroyed so many earlier Christian communities. By showing that Christianity enhanced rather than threatened Roman military effectiveness, Marcus made it possible for the faith to grow within the very institutions that had been its greatest enemies. And this was just the beginning, because Marcus's success with his own unit was about to attract attention from the highest levels of the Roman government, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform not just the military, but the entire imperial system from the ground up. The story of how one converted centurion's innovative approach to Christian evangelism reached the ears of Emperor Constantine himself, and how that encounter changed the course of Western civilization forever, reveals principles of influence and cultural transformation that continue to shape our world today. The transformation Marcus achieved within his unit didn't go unnoticed. Word of his remarkable success began to spread through the complex network of military communications that connected every corner of the empire. Veteran soldiers talked about it in taverns. Officers mentioned it in their reports. Even the camp followers and merchants who serviced the legions carried stories of the centurion whose men fought like heroes but acted like saints. What made these stories so compelling wasn't just their novelty. It was their practical implications for an empire facing its greatest crisis in 3 centuries. The Roman military machine was showing signs of strain that terrified anyone with eyes to see. Recruitment was becoming increasingly difficult as Roman citizens grew reluctant to serve in endless campaigns that seemed to accomplish nothing but creating new enemies. Discipline was breaking down as soldiers lost faith in commanders who appeared more interested in personal advancement than victory. Morale was plummeting as the very purpose of Roman expansion became unclear to the men expected to die for it. Into this crisis stepped Marcus with a solution that seemed almost too good to be true. His soldiers weren't just more disciplined than their peers. They were genuinely motivated by something deeper than fear of punishment or hope of reward. They fought harder, marched farther, and endured more hardship than units that relied on traditional Roman military psychology. Most remarkably of all, they seemed to actually enjoy their service, finding meaning and purpose in duties that left other soldiers bitter and resentful. The secret, though Marcus was careful never to reveal it directly, was that his men had discovered something the Roman military system had never been able to provide: a sense of ultimate purpose that transcended the immediate circumstances of their service. When you believe you're serving the creator of the universe, when you understand your daily duties as part of a cosmic plan for human salvation, when you see every act of service as a worship and every moment of sacrifice as participation in divine love, then the hardships of military life become not just bearable, but meaningful. But Marcus faced a delicate balancing act. He needed to maintain the religious practices required of all Roman soldiers while simultaneously nurturing the Christian faith that was transforming his unit from within. This required a level of subtlety and wisdom that would have challenged the most experienced theologian, let alone a career soldier with no formal training in religious diplomacy. The solution he developed reveals just how deeply Marcus understood both Roman military culture and Christian spiritual principles. Instead of trying to eliminate pagan religious observances, Marcus reinterpreted them through a Christian lens that preserved their social function while transforming their spiritual meaning. When his unit performed the traditional morning sacrifice to Mars, Marcus taught his Christian soldiers to see it as an opportunity to pray for peace and protection for all people affected by warfare. When they swore oaths of loyalty to Caesar, Marcus helped them understand these pledges as commitments to serve God by serving earthly authority with integrity and excellence. When they participated in victory celebrations that honored Jupiter and the other gods, Marcus encouraged his men to use these occasions for private thanksgiving to the true source of all success and blessing. This wasn't deception or compromise. This was a sophisticated understanding of how religious transformation actually works in real human communities. Marcus recognized that you can't simply tear down existing religious structures without replacing them with something that meets the same psychological and social needs. By showing his soldiers how to find Christian meaning within Roman religious forms, he allowed them to maintain their social integration while experiencing spiritual transformation. The genius of this approach became apparent when Marcus's unit was transferred to a new posting in Gaul, where they would serve alongside legions that had never heard of his innovative methods. Instead of being exposed as secret Christians and facing immediate persecution, Marcus's soldiers appeared to their new comrades as exceptionally devout Romans, whose superior discipline and effectiveness stemmed from their deeper commitment to traditional military virtues. But appearances can be deceiving, and the Christian transformation of Marcus's unit began to influence the broader military community in ways that were both subtle and profound. Other centurions started asking Marcus about his training methods. Junior officers requested permission to observe his unit's daily routines. Even senior commanders began seeking his advice on how to improve morale and discipline among their own troops. Each of these interactions became an opportunity for Marcus to plant seeds of Christian understanding without ever mentioning Christianity directly. When asked about his approach to military discipline, Marcus would explain that true obedience came from love and respect rather than fear and intimidation. When questioned about his unit's exceptional courage in battle, Marcus would describe how soldiers fought more effectively when they understood their service as part of a larger moral purpose. When pressed for details about his leadership philosophy, Marcus would speak about the importance of serving those under your command rather than simply commanding those who served under you. These conversations had a cumulative effect that Marcus himself probably didn't fully appreciate at the time. He was introducing Christian concepts and values into the highest levels of Roman military culture, but he was doing it in language and contexts that made these ideas seem like natural extensions of the best Roman traditions, rather than foreign imports that threatened the established order. The breakthrough came during the winter of 313 AD, when Marcus's legion was stationed near Augusta Treverorum, modern-day Trier, which served as one of the imperial capitals during the period of the divided empire. It was here that Marcus would encounter the man who would change not just his own destiny, but the entire trajectory of Christian history. Constantine was not yet the Christian emperor of legend. At this point in his career, he was simply one of 4 men claiming the imperial purple, controlling the western provinces through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and religious pragmatism that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. Constantine understood that successful rulers didn't impose their personal beliefs on their subjects. They found ways to align their subjects' existing beliefs with their own political objectives. But Constantine faced a problem that traditional Roman religious approaches couldn't solve. The empire was fragmenting not just politically, but spiritually. The old gods were losing their power to inspire sacrifice and loyalty among populations that had grown cynical about the promises of imperial prosperity and peace. The mystery religions that had filled this spiritual vacuum were too individualistic and otherworldly to provide the social cohesion that effective government required. Even the emperor cult that had served as a unifying force for centuries was losing credibility as the reality of imperial weakness became impossible to ignore. Constantine needed something new, something that could unite diverse populations under a common vision while providing the moral foundation necessary for stable government, something that could inspire genuine devotion rather than grudging compliance. Something that could transform the empire's subjects from reluctant taxpayers into willing participants in a renewed imperial project. The answer to Constantine's prayers came in the form of a report from one of his most trusted military advisors about an unusual centurion whose innovative leadership methods were producing extraordinary results throughout the Gallic legions. The advisor didn't mention Christianity because Marcus had been careful never to reveal the true source of his techniques to anyone who might carry tales back to imperial headquarters. But he did describe a military leader who had discovered ways to inspire the kind of loyalty, dedication, and moral purpose that the empire desperately needed. Constantine's interest was immediately piqued. As a student of military history and political strategy, he understood that successful empires were built not just on superior force, but on superior to inspire voluntary cooperation from conquered peoples. The Romans had succeeded where other empires failed because they had offered their subjects something more attractive than mere survival. They had offered participation in a civilization that seemed destined to bring order, prosperity, and meaning to the entire known world. But that offer was losing its credibility as the empire's problems multiplied and its promises rang increasingly hollow. Constantine needed to find new sources of inspiration, new reasons for people to believe in the imperial project, new foundations for the loyalty and sacrifice that effective government required. The report about Marcus suggested that such foundations might already exist, hidden within the empire's own military institutions, waiting to be discovered and cultivated by leaders wise enough to recognize their potential. Constantine ordered an immediate investigation into this remarkable centurion's methods, with particular attention to their potential for broader application throughout the imperial system. What happened next would depend entirely on Marcus's ability to navigate the most dangerous political waters imaginable. How do you explain Christian principles to a pagan emperor without revealing that they are Christian principles? How do you demonstrate the effectiveness of faith-based leadership to someone whose entire worldview is built on secular assumptions about power and human nature? How do you plant seeds of spiritual transformation in soil that has been prepared by centuries of religious and philosophical traditions that explicitly reject everything you believe? Marcus was about to discover that converting individual soldiers was simple compared to the challenge of influencing imperial policy. But he was also about to learn that God had been preparing him for exactly this opportunity through every hardship he had endured, every skill he had developed, and every relationship he had built during his years of faithful service in the Roman legions. The meeting that would change the course of Western civilization was arranged for a cold February morning in the imperial residence at Augusta Treverorum. Constantine, accompanied by his closest advisors and military commanders, would interview the centurion, whose mysterious methods had captured the attention of the entire Gallic command structure. Marcus entered the imperial presence knowing that everything he said in the next hour could determine not just his own fate, but the future of Christianity throughout the Roman world. One wrong word, one suspicious phrase, one hint that his effectiveness stemmed from loyalty to a power higher than Caesar, and he would find himself facing the same execution that had claimed Caius and so many other Christian martyrs. But Marcus also entered that room with something that most Christians of his era lacked: complete confidence that his faith enhanced rather than threatened his effectiveness as a Roman soldier. He wasn't trying to hide his Christianity because he was ashamed of it. He was being strategic about how he revealed it because he understood that timing and context determine whether truth is heard as liberation or condemned as treason. Constantine's first question cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Centurion, my advisors tell me that your men display unusual loyalty and effectiveness. In your opinion, what accounts for this difference?" Marcus's answer would echo through the centuries, not because it was eloquent or theologically sophisticated, but because it demonstrated perfect understanding of how to communicate Christian truth in language that pagan ears could hear and pagan minds could accept. "Caesar, I have discovered that soldiers fight most effectively when they understand their service as participation in something greater than themselves. The traditional Roman virtues of discipline, courage, and loyalty reach their highest expression when they are directed toward ultimate rather than immediate purposes. When men serve not just for pay or promotion, or even patriotic duty, but because they believe their service contributes to a cosmic plan for human flourishing, they will endure hardships and make sacrifices that seem impossible to those motivated by lesser concerns." Constantine leaned forward, his political instincts immediately recognizing the implications of what Marcus was describing. "And how precisely do you cultivate this sense of ultimate purpose among soldiers who come from diverse backgrounds and hold various religious beliefs?" "By showing them that the virtues they already admire and attempt to practice are actually reflections of transcendent truths that give meaning to all human existence. Every soldier wants to be disciplined, courageous, and loyal. My role is simply to help them understand that these qualities connect them to something eternal and infinite that transforms their daily duties from mere obligations into acts of worship and service." The room fell silent as Constantine and his advisors absorbed the implications of Marcus's words. Here was a military leader who had discovered how to tap into spiritual resources that made soldiers more effective rather than less. Here was someone who had found ways to unite diverse populations around shared values without requiring them to abandon their particular traditions and beliefs. Here was a model for the kind of renewed imperial project that Constantine had been searching for throughout his political career. But Constantine was too experienced a politician to accept anything at face value. "Centurion, these are impressive claims, but claims must be supported by evidence. Can you demonstrate the practical effectiveness of these methods?" Marcus smiled with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for exactly this question for months. "Caesar, my unit currently holds records for discipline, training efficiency, and combat effectiveness throughout the Gallic command. But more importantly, we have achieved these results while maintaining the highest standards of moral conduct toward both fellow soldiers and civilian populations. My men don't just fight well. They represent the empire with honor, treating conquered peoples with justice and mercy that creates loyalty rather than resentment." This was exactly what Constantine needed to hear. The traditional Roman approach to conquered territories had always relied heavily on intimidation and force, which worked well in the short term but created long-term problems as resentful populations looked for opportunities to rebel against imperial authority. Marcus was describing an alternative approach that might actually strengthen the empire by transforming subjects into genuine supporters. "And you believe these methods could be successfully implemented on a larger scale?" Constantine asked. "Caesar, I believe they represent the natural fulfillment of the best Roman traditions. We are not abandoning anything that has made Rome great. We are discovering how to make Rome greater by aligning our earthly service with eternal principles that give ultimate meaning to temporal actions. Constantine exchanged glances with his advisors, and Marcus could see the wheels of imperial calculation turning behind the emperor's eyes. This wasn't just about military effectiveness anymore. This was about the possibility of renovating the entire imperial project around principles that could inspire genuine devotion rather than grudging compliance. But Constantine had one more question, and Marcus knew that his answer would determine everything that followed. Centurion, you speak of eternal principles and transcendent truths. What god or gods do you believe provide the foundation for these ultimate purposes you describe? The moment of truth had arrived. Marcus could give a safe answer that preserved his position while limiting his influence, or he could take the greatest risk of his life by revealing the true source of his transformation, trusting that Constantine's practical interest in effective governance would outweigh his theoretical commitment to traditional Roman religion. Marcus chose truth over safety, but he chose it strategically. Caesar, I serve the God who created all things, who governs all things, and who will judge all things according to perfect justice and mercy. This God has revealed himself through his Son, who demonstrated the ultimate expression of the military virtues we honor: perfect discipline in the face of temptation, perfect courage in the face of death, and perfect loyalty to his divine mission, even when it required the ultimate sacrifice. I believe this God desires to bless the Roman Empire by transforming it into an instrument of justice, mercy, and peace that serves not just Roman interests, but the welfare of all humanity. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Marcus had just confessed his Christianity to the Roman emperor, gambling everything on his belief that Constantine would be more interested in results than religious orthodoxy. What happened next would determine whether Christianity remained a persecuted minority religion or became the spiritual foundation of the greatest empire in human history. Constantine rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the city that represented centuries of Roman achievement and ambition. When he finally spoke, his words would launch a transformation that would reshape not just the empire, but the entire course of Western civilization. Centurion, I have spent my entire career searching for ways to unite this empire around principles that could inspire genuine loyalty and sacrifice. Traditional Roman religion served this purpose for centuries, but it no longer speaks to the hearts of our people. The mystery cults offer personal salvation, but no social cohesion. The philosophical schools provide intellectual satisfaction, but no practical guidance for governance. Constantine turned back to face Marcus, and his expression revealed a man who had just glimpsed possibilities that exceeded his wildest political ambitions. But you describe something different. A faith that enhances rather than threatens Roman military effectiveness. A God who desires to bless rather than destroy the empire. A spiritual foundation that could unite diverse populations around shared moral commitments while preserving the practical advantages that have made Rome great. Marcus held his breath, knowing that the next words out of Constantine's mouth would either launch the greatest missionary opportunity in Christian history or send him to the executioner's block. Tell me more about this God of yours, Centurion. Tell me everything. And so began the most extraordinary theological conversation in the history of the Roman Empire. Not in a cathedral or monastery, not between trained theologians or religious scholars, but in an imperial residence between a battle-hardened centurion and the most powerful man in the Western world. Marcus understood that this wasn't just about sharing his personal faith story. This was about translating the entire Christian worldview into concepts that could reshape imperial policy. Constantine listened with the focused intensity of a military strategist, analyzing enemy positions as Marcus explained how his God operated through principles that perfectly aligned with the empire's deepest aspirations. Where Roman religion promised victory through superior force, Christianity offered triumph through moral transformation. Where traditional paganism divided humanity into citizens and barbarians, The Christian gospel spoke of universal brotherhood under divine authority. Where the old gods demanded sacrifice to maintain their favor, Christ had already made the ultimate sacrifice to secure eternal blessing for all who would receive it. But Constantine wasn't interested in abstract theology. He was a pragmatist who needed to understand how these spiritual principles could solve real political problems. So Marcus focused on the practical implications of Christian teaching for imperial governance. He explained how Christian virtues like justice, mercy, and humility could actually strengthen rather than weaken imperial authority by creating genuine loyalty instead of fearful compliance. Caesar, Marcus said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had seen these principles transform hardened warriors into devoted servants. Imagine an empire where subjects obeyed not because they feared punishment, but because they respected the moral character of their rulers. Imagine provinces that contributed to imperial prosperity, not because they were forced to, but because they genuinely. Imagine an army that fought not just for conquest, and genuinely believed their participation served a higher purpose. Plunder, but for the protection of justice and the spread of civilization that truly deserved to be called civilized. Constantine's political instincts immediately grasped the revolutionary implications of what Marcus was describing. The Roman Empire had always maintained control through a combination of military force, economic incentives, and cultural superiority. But each of these methods created its own problems. Military force bred resentment and rebellion. Economic incentives were expensive and ultimately unsustainable. Cultural superiority was becoming harder to maintain as the empire's problems multiplied and its promises rang increasingly hollow. But Marcus was describing a fourth foundation for imperial authority: moral legitimacy derived from genuine service to transcendent principles that even conquered peoples could recognize and respect. This wasn't about imposing Roman religion on diverse populations. This was about discovering universal moral truths that could unite different cultures around shared commitments to justice, mercy, and human flourishing. The genius of Constantine's response reveals why he became one of history's most successful political leaders. Instead of asking theological questions about the nature of God or the mechanics of salvation, Constantine immediately focused on the practical applications of Christian principles for imperial governance. How would Christian morality affect tax collection? How would Christian ethics influence military strategy? How would Christian teachings reshape the relationship between rulers and subjects throughout the empire? Marcus had anticipated these questions because he had been wrestling with them himself ever since his conversion. His answers revealed a level of political sophistication that impressed even Constantine's most experienced advisors. Christianity didn't eliminate the need for effective government. It enhanced government effectiveness by providing moral foundations that made coercion unnecessary and voluntary cooperation natural. Caesar, consider how much simpler administration becomes when subjects trust their rulers to act with justice and integrity. Consider how much stronger military units become when soldiers believe their commanders genuinely care about their welfare. Consider how much more prosperous provinces become when governors focus on serving their people rather than exploiting them for personal gain. But Constantine pushed deeper, asking the question that revealed his true understanding of political power. Centurion, these benefits you describe are attractive, but they depend entirely on rulers actually possessing the moral character you claim Christianity produces. What prevents Christian leaders from becoming as corrupt as pagan ones? What mechanisms does your faith provide to ensure that power doesn't corrupt even those who begin with the best intentions? Marcus's answer revealed why his approach to Christian evangelism had been so effective with Roman soldiers. He didn't just talk about Christian ideals, he explained the practical systems and disciplines that made those ideals achievable in real-world circumstances. Caesar, Christianity provides what Roman philosophy promises but cannot deliver, a source of strength outside ourselves that enables us to overcome our natural tendency towards selfishness and corruption. When we understand ourselves as servants of the God who created all things, when we believe we will ultimately answer to perfect justice for how we use whatever authority we've been given, when we experience daily the transforming power of divine love that changes our very desires and motivations, then serving others becomes not just a duty, but a joy. Constantine was silent for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what Marcus had just described. Here was a system of belief that could potentially solve the empire's greatest challenge: how to maintain effective government over vast distances and diverse populations without relying primarily on fear and force. But Constantine was also calculating the risks. Converting to Christianity would align him with a still minority religion that faced ongoing persecution in many parts of the empire. It would require him to abandon the religious traditions that had legitimized Roman rule for centuries. Most dangerously, it would put him in potential conflict with the powerful pagan priesthoods and senatorial families whose support he needed to maintain political stability. Yet the potential benefits were enormous. Christianity was growing rapidly throughout the empire, especially among the urban populations that were most important for economic prosperity and administrative efficiency. Christian communities had demonstrated remarkable resilience under persecution, suggesting that they possessed exactly the kind of moral strength and social cohesion that the empire needed. Most importantly, Christianity offered a vision of human dignity and universal purpose that could inspire the kind of genuine loyalty that no amount of military force could compel. Constantine's decision would ultimately rest on his assessment of Christianity's practical effectiveness rather than its theological truth. But Marcus understood that for someone in Constantine's position, practical effectiveness and theological truth were inseparable. A faith that couldn't improve imperial governance wasn't worth adopting, regardless of its claims about eternal salvation. But a faith that could transform the empire into something genuinely worthy of respect and loyalty was worth any personal or political risk. "Centurion," Constantine finally said, "I find myself intrigued by the possibilities you describe. But I need more than theoretical explanations. I need concrete demonstrations that these principles can work on the scale that imperial governance requires." This was exactly what Marcus had been hoping to hear. Constantine wasn't asking for theological arguments or miraculous signs. He was asking for proof that Christian principles could solve real problems in measurable ways. And Marcus had been preparing for exactly this challenge ever since his conversion. "Caesar, I propose an experiment. Give me command of a troubled province, somewhere that traditional Roman methods have failed to establish lasting peace and prosperity. Allow me to implement Christian principles of governance for a period of 5 years. Judge the results not by religious criteria, but by the practical standards you would apply to any provincial administrator: tax collection, crime reduction, economic development, and population loyalty." Constantine's advisors exchanged concerned glances. This was an extraordinary proposal that violated every precedent for imperial administration. Provinces were governed by senators or equestrians, whose loyalty had been proven through decades of service within traditional Roman institutions. The idea of appointing a centurion, even an exceptional one, to such a position was revolutionary enough. The idea of allowing him to experiment with foreign religious principles was almost unthinkable. But Constantine was thinking on a completely different level. He recognized that the empire's traditional methods were failing in province after province. Rebellions were becoming more frequent and more difficult to suppress. Tax revenues were declining as populations grew increasingly resentful of imperial demands. Even successful military campaigns were creating more problems than they solved, as conquered territories required ever larger garrison forces to maintain order. Marcus was offering something that no traditional Roman administrator could provide: a completely new approach to imperial governance based on principles that had already proven their effectiveness in military contexts. If Christian methods could transform undisciplined soldiers into elite warriors, perhaps they could also transform rebellious provinces into loyal contributors to imperial prosperity. The political calculation was complex, but clear. If Marcus succeeded, Constantine would gain credit for discovering innovative solutions to the empire's most pressing problems. If Marcus failed, Constantine could distance himself from the experiment while learning valuable lessons about the limitations of Christian principles in governmental contexts. But there was something else driving Constantine's interest, something that his advisors couldn't fully understand because they hadn't experienced it themselves. Constantine had spent his entire career searching for sources of meaning and purpose that could sustain him through the brutal demands of imperial politics. The traditional Roman gods had never provided more than symbolic legitimacy for actions that Constantine often knew were morally questionable but politically necessary. Marcus was describing a god who could provide not just symbolic legitimacy, but actual moral guidance for the complex decisions that imperial leadership required. A god who cared about justice and mercy, not just victory and dominance. A god who could transform rulers as well as subjects, providing the inner strength necessary to choose long-term wisdom over short-term advantage. "Very well, Centurion," Constantine said, with a decisiveness that had made him one of history's most effective military commanders. "I will give you what you ask. But I will also give you more than you ask. I want you to serve not just as a provincial administrator, but as my personal advisor on the implementation of these Christian principles throughout the imperial system." The room fell silent as the implications of Constantine's words sank in. Marcus had just been appointed to a position that didn't officially exist, but that could potentially influence every aspect of imperial policy. He would have the emperor's ear on questions ranging from military strategy to economic development to religious tolerance. Most importantly, he would have the opportunity to demonstrate Christian principles at the highest levels of Roman government. But Constantine wasn't finished. "Moreover, Centurion, I want you to begin immediately recruiting other military officers who share your understanding of these enhanced Roman virtues. I want to see whether your methods can be successfully implemented by others, or whether they depend entirely on your personal qualities and experiences." This was the moment Marcus had been praying for ever since his conversion, not just the opportunity to serve Christ in his individual capacity, but the chance to create systems and institutions that could spread Christian influence throughout the empire's power structures. Constantine was essentially asking him to develop a new model of Christian discipleship, specifically designed for Roman political and military leaders. Marcus understood that he was being offered something unprecedented in Christian history: the opportunity to shape imperial policy from within, rather than simply enduring persecution from without. This wasn't about converting the empire to Christianity through dramatic public declarations or miraculous demonstrations. This was about demonstrating that Christian principles could make the empire more effective, more just, and more sustainable than it had ever been under pagan leadership. But Marcus also understood that he was entering territory that no Christian had ever navigated before. How do you maintain your spiritual integrity while exercising political power? How do you serve Christ while serving Caesar? How do you implement Christian principles within systems that were designed according to completely different assumptions about human nature and social organization? The answers to these questions would determine not just Marcus's personal success or failure, but the entire future relationship between Christianity and political authority. If Marcus succeeded, he would establish precedents that could guide Christian leaders for centuries to come. If he failed, he might discredit Christian involvement in government for generations. Constantine seemed to sense the weight of what he was asking. "Centurion, I won't pretend that what I'm offering you is safe or easy. You will face opposition from traditionalists who see any change as a threat to Roman greatness. You will be watched by enemies who would love to use any mistake you make as evidence that Christian principles are incompatible with effective governance. Most dangerously, you will be tempted by the very power I'm giving you to compromise the principles that made you effective in the first place. Marcus nodded, understanding that Constantine was speaking from bitter personal experience about the corrupting influence of political authority. Caesar, I accept both the opportunity and the risks. But I also ask for one guarantee, that you will judge my performance by results rather than methods, and that you will give these principles enough time to demonstrate their effectiveness before abandoning them if they don't produce immediate results. Agreed, Constantine replied, but I also have one requirement of my own. I want you to document everything you do, every decision you make, every principle you apply, and every result you achieve. If these Christian methods prove effective, I want to be able to replicate them throughout the empire. If they prove ineffective, I want to understand exactly why they failed so that we can avoid similar mistakes in the future. And so began the most ambitious experiment in Christian politics that the world had ever seen. Marcus would have the resources of the Roman Empire at his disposal, the personal backing of the emperor, and the opportunity to demonstrate Christian principles on a scale that could influence the entire course of human history. But he would also face challenges that would test every aspect of his faith, his wisdom, and his character. Because transforming individuals was one thing, transforming institutions was something else entirely. And transforming an empire, that would require nothing short of a miracle. Fortunately for Marcus, and for the countless millions who would benefit from his success, he served a god who specialized in the impossible. The province Constantine assigned to Marcus was Britannia, the empire's most remote and troubled territory. For over 2 centuries, Roman legions had struggled to maintain control over Celtic tribes who seemed to view rebellion as a religious duty rather than a political choice. 3 different emperors had built walls across the northern frontier, trying to contain Scottish raids that disrupted agriculture and commerce throughout the province. Even worse, the Roman administrators sent to govern Britannia had developed a reputation for corruption and brutality that made the local population view imperial authority as little more than organized extortion. Marcus understood immediately why Constantine had chosen this particular assignment. If Christian principles could bring peace and prosperity to Britannia, they could work anywhere in the empire. If they failed in this remote corner of the Roman world, Constantine could abandon the experiment without damaging his reputation or destabilizing the imperial system. But Marcus also recognized the extraordinary opportunity that Britannia represented. This was a province where traditional Roman methods had clearly failed, where the population was desperate for effective leadership, and where success would be immediately visible to the entire empire. Most importantly, this was a place where he could implement Christian principles without having to work within existing power structures that might resist innovation. The journey to Britannia gave Marcus time to develop the comprehensive strategy that would guide his administration for the next 5 years. He understood that he wasn't just governing a province. He was conducting an experiment that could determine the future relationship between Christianity and political power throughout the civilized world. Marcus's first innovation was to recruit a completely different kind of administrative staff than any Roman province had ever seen. Instead of appointing senators' sons and political allies to key positions, Marcus chose men based on their character, competence, and commitment to the principles he intended to implement. Many of his appointees were Christians, but Marcus was careful to include capable pagans who demonstrated the kind of integrity and public spiritedness that Christian teaching encouraged. This wasn't religious favoritism. This was the practical application of Christian principles to the challenge of institutional leadership. Marcus understood that good governance required good people, and that good people were more likely to be found among those who understood their work as service to something greater than themselves, regardless of their specific religious beliefs. The results were immediately apparent to everyone who interacted with the provincial administration. For the first time in decades, Roman officials in Britannia seemed genuinely interested in solving problems rather than exploiting them. Tax collection became more efficient and less oppressive, as collectors focused on maximizing revenue through economic development rather than squeezing existing resources. Legal proceedings became fairer and more predictable, as judges applied consistent standards based on justice rather than political connections or personal bribes. Most remarkably, the relationship between Roman administrators and British tribal leaders began to change from one of mutual hostility to something approaching genuine cooperation. Marcus implemented what he called consultative governance, regularly meeting with tribal councils to understand their concerns and involving them in decisions that affected their communities. This wasn't weakness or compromise. This was the practical application of Christian principles about human dignity and the importance of serving those under your authority. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Centuries of mistrust and resentment couldn't be overcome in a matter of months. But Marcus's approach began producing results that impressed even the most skeptical observers. Tribal raids decreased dramatically as local leaders discovered that cooperation with Roman authority brought more benefits than resistance. Agricultural production increased as farmers gained confidence that they would be able to keep the fruits of their labor. Trade expanded as merchants realized that Roman roads and Roman law could protect their investments rather than simply taxing them into poverty. But Marcus's greatest achievement wasn't administrative. It was cultural. He began demonstrating that Roman civilization could offer something more attractive than superior force. It could offer a vision of human flourishing that even conquered peoples could embrace and make their own. The key to this cultural transformation was Marcus's understanding of how Christian principles could enhance rather than replace existing tribal values. Instead of demanding that British tribes abandon their traditions and customs, Marcus showed them how Christian virtues like courage, loyalty, and justice could perfect and fulfill the best aspects of Celtic culture. When tribal leaders spoke about their warriors' bravery in battle, Marcus would agree and then describe how true courage included the strength to show mercy to defeated enemies. When they praised their people's loyalty to clan and king, Marcus would affirm this devotion and then explain how it reflected humanity's deeper loyalty to the divine authority that established all legitimate earthly powers. When they celebrated their commitment to justice and honor, Marcus would enthusiastically support these values while demonstrating how Christian understanding could make justice more perfect and honor more complete. This approach accomplished something that traditional Roman cultural imperialism had never achieved. It made Roman rule genuinely attractive to subject populations rather than merely tolerable. British tribes began to see participation in the empire not as submission to foreign domination, but as membership in a civilization that honored their deepest values while offering them opportunities to express those values on a larger scale. The military implications of this cultural transformation were profound. Instead of requiring large garrison forces to suppress constant rebellions, Britannia began producing volunteer auxiliary units that served the empire with the same dedication that Roman citizens displayed. British warriors, who had once fought against Roman legions, now fought alongside them, not as unwilling conscripts, but as proud defenders of a civilization they had come to see as their own. Marcus's success in Britannia attracted attention throughout the empire, but it also created powerful enemies among traditionalists who viewed any departure from established Roman methods as dangerous innovation that threatened the foundations of imperial greatness. These critics argued that Marcus's approach might work in a remote province like Britannia, but that it would prove disastrous if applied to more strategically important territories where Roman authority faced more sophisticated challenges. Constantine, however, was convinced that Marcus had discovered principles that could transform the entire imperial system. The emperor began implementing similar approaches in other troubled provinces, appointing administrators who shared Marcus's understanding of governance as service rather than domination. More importantly, Constantine began incorporating Christian advisors into his inner circle, seeking their counsel on questions ranging from military strategy to economic policy to religious tolerance. The culmination of this process came in 313 AD, when Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, officially ending the persecution of Christians throughout the empire and establishing Christianity as a legally recognized religion. But this wasn't just a matter of religious tolerance. It was the beginning of a fundamental transformation in the nature of imperial authority itself. Constantine had become convinced, largely through observing Marcus's success in Britannia, that Christian principles could provide the moral foundation that the empire needed to survive and prosper in an increasingly complex world. Instead of ruling through fear and force alone, Roman emperors could govern through moral legitimacy derived from genuine service to transcendent principles that even subject populations could recognize and respect. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without its costs and complications. But Marcus had demonstrated something that would reshape not just the Roman Empire, but the entire relationship between religious faith and political power for centuries to come. That Christian principles could enhance rather than threaten effective governance, and that serving God and serving Caesar were not necessarily incompatible commitments. The ripple effects of Marcus's experiment in Christian governance spread far beyond the borders of Britannia or even the Roman Empire itself. He had created a new model of Christian discipleship that showed how believers could engage with political power without compromising their spiritual integrity. More importantly, he had proven that Christian virtues like justice, mercy, and humility could make governments more effective rather than less. But perhaps Marcus's greatest achievement was demonstrating that the gospel message could transform not just individual hearts, but entire civilizations. The same faith that had changed a hardened centurion's understanding of courage, discipline, and loyalty had now begun changing an empire's understanding of authority, governance, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. The revolution that had begun in a prison cell in Singidunum, sparked by one soldier's encounter with Christian prisoners who demonstrated a different kind of strength, had now reached the highest levels of imperial power. And this was still just the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately reshape the entire Western world, according to principles that a converted Roman centurion had first learned from watching Christians face death with joy, hope, and unshakable faith in the God who turns worldly wisdom upside down and makes the last first and the first last. The transformation Marcus achieved in Britannia sent shockwaves through the imperial court that reached far beyond what Constantine had initially anticipated. By 315 AD, reports were flooding in from across the empire, describing unprecedented changes in provinces where Christian administrators had been appointed following Marcus's model. Tax revenues were increasing, not through heavier burdens, but through expanded economic activity. Military recruitment was becoming easier as young men actually wanted to serve under commanders who treated them with dignity and respect. Most remarkably, the chronic rebellions that had plagued frontier provinces for generations were being replaced by something the empire had rarely experienced: genuine loyalty from conquered peoples. But success at this scale inevitably attracted scrutiny from the most powerful and conservative elements of Roman society. The senatorial class, whose wealth and status depended on the traditional systems of provincial exploitation, began organizing opposition to what they saw as dangerous innovations that threatened the natural order of Roman civilization. The pagan priesthoods, whose influence had already been weakened by decades of declining religious observance, recognized that Christian governance represented an existential threat to their remaining authority. Even within the military, there were officers who viewed Marcus's methods as soft and potentially disastrous for imperial security. The leader of this conservative backlash was Senator Gaius Valerius Maximus, a man whose family had served in the highest positions of Roman government for over 3 centuries. Maximus possessed the kind of political cunning and institutional knowledge that made him a formidable opponent to anyone who threatened the established order. More importantly, he understood that the most effective way to discredit Marcus wasn't to attack his character or his results, but to question whether his methods could survive the kind of serious military crisis that had always been the ultimate test of Roman leadership. Maximus began quietly building a coalition of senators, generals, and provincial governors who shared his concerns about the long-term implications of Christian governance. These weren't necessarily bad men or even particularly religious people. They were practical politicians who had spent their careers learning how to maintain Roman power through tried and tested methods. From their perspective, Marcus's innovations might work during periods of relative peace and prosperity, but they would prove catastrophically inadequate when the empire faced the kind of existential threats that had periodically challenged Roman survival throughout its history. The opportunity to test this theory came sooner than anyone expected. In the spring of 316 AD, a confederation of Germanic tribes launched the largest coordinated invasion of Roman territory in over a century. The Alemanni, Franks, and Saxons had apparently spent years planning this massive assault, timing it to coincide with what they perceived as Roman weakness under Christian influence. Intelligence reports suggested that the barbarian leaders had specifically targeted provinces governed by Marcus's protégés, believing that Christian administrators would be less capable of organizing effective military responses. Constantine faced a decision that would determine not just the fate of his political experiment, but possibly the survival of the empire itself. He could recall Marcus from Britannia and abandon the Christian governance project in favor of traditional military commanders who understood warfare according to established Roman doctrine. Or he could double down on his investment in Christian leadership by giving Marcus command of the imperial response to this unprecedented crisis. The emperor's advisors were deeply divided. His military experts argued that this was precisely the kind of situation that required proven traditional methods rather than untested innovations. His political counselors warned that failure under Christian leadership would discredit Constantine's entire reform program and potentially cost him the throne. Even some of his Christian advisors suggested that it might be wise to separate religious principles from military necessity during times of genuine emergency. But Constantine had learned something from watching Marcus that his advisors hadn't fully grasped. The centurion's success hadn't come from abandoning Roman military virtues, but from perfecting them through Christian understanding. His soldiers fought more effectively not because they were less disciplined, but because their discipline was motivated by love rather than fear. His strategies succeeded not because they were less aggressive, but because they were more intelligent about achieving lasting victory rather than temporary dominance. Constantine's decision revealed why he would be remembered as one of history's great leaders. Instead of retreating from innovation in the face of crisis, he accelerated it. Marcus was recalled from Britannia and given command not just of the military response to the Germanic invasion, but of a complete reorganization of the empire's northern frontier defenses according to Christian principles of warfare. This appointment sent shockwaves through both the imperial court and the barbarian confederacy. Roman traditionalists saw it as proof that Constantine had lost his political judgment, while Germanic leaders interpreted it as evidence that their intelligence about Christian weakness was correct. Both groups would soon discover that they had seriously misunderstood the nature of the transformation that Marcus represented. Marcus's first action as commander of the northern frontier was to do something that violated every precedent in Roman military history. Instead of immediately mobilizing legions for a massive counterattack, he sent envoys to the Germanic Confederation, requesting a meeting with their leaders to discuss terms for peaceful coexistence. The envoys carried not threats of destruction, but proposals for trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and mutual defense pacts that could benefit both Roman and Germanic peoples. The barbarian leaders' initial reaction was exactly what Marcus had anticipated. They interpreted his overtures as signs of weakness and responded with even more aggressive military preparations. But Marcus had been counting on this response because it would demonstrate to his own soldiers and to observers throughout the empire that Christian approaches to conflict resolution weren't based on naivety about human nature, but on sophisticated understanding of how to transform enemies into allies. While Germanic armies were massing for what they expected to be easy victories over weakened Roman forces, Marcus was implementing a defensive strategy that combined traditional military excellence with innovative approaches to psychological warfare. Instead of simply preparing to repel invasions, Marcus was creating conditions that would make the invaders question whether their campaigns were actually in their own best interests. The key to Marcus's strategy was understanding something that traditional Roman commanders had never fully grasped: that barbarian raids were usually motivated by desperation rather than simple aggression. Germanic tribes weren't attacking Roman territories because they hated Roman civilization, but because they needed resources, security, and opportunities that their traditional way of life couldn't provide. If Rome could offer these things through partnership rather than conquest, most barbarian leaders would prefer cooperation to the risks and costs of military conflict. But Marcus also understood that barbarian leaders couldn't simply accept Roman offers without losing face among their own warriors. Any successful diplomatic solution would have to allow Germanic chiefs to claim victory while actually choosing peace. This required a level of psychological sophistication that most Roman commanders considered beneath the dignity of imperial authority. Marcus's approach began with military demonstrations that proved Roman strength, while simultaneously offering Germanic leaders graceful exits from conflicts they were increasingly likely to lose. When the first wave of barbarian raids crossed the Rhine frontier, they encountered Roman defenses that were clearly superior to anything they had faced before. But instead of pursuing retreating raiders and inflicting the kind of devastating casualties that would have demanded revenge, Marcus's forces allowed dignified withdrawals while making it clear that future incursions would face even more formidable resistance. At the same time, Marcus began implementing what he called constructive engagement with Germanic communities that weren't participating in the raids. Roman merchants were given military escorts to establish trading relationships with peaceful tribes. Roman engineers offered to help with infrastructure projects that could improve Germanic agriculture and craftsmanship. Roman teachers were made available to tribal leaders who wanted their children to learn Latin and Roman administrative techniques. These initiatives weren't charitable gestures or signs of Roman weakness. They were strategic investments in creating alternatives to warfare that served both Roman and Germanic interests. Marcus understood that the most effective way to end military conflicts was to make peace more profitable than war for all parties involved. The results exceeded even Marcus's expectations. Within months, the Germanic Confederation began fragmenting as individual tribes started questioning whether they really wanted to risk Roman retaliation when peaceful alternatives were available. Tribal leaders, who had initially supported the invasion, began sending secret envoys to Marcus, exploring possibilities for separate peace agreements that could protect their people, while maintaining their dignity. But Marcus's greatest diplomatic triumph came through his handling of the Confederation's most aggressive leader, a Saxon chief named Widukind, who had earned a reputation for both military prowess and implacable hatred of Roman civilization. Instead of treating Widukind as an irredeemable enemy, Marcus began studying the chief's background and motivations, looking for ways to address the underlying grievances that fueled his hostility toward Rome. Marcus discovered that Widukind's anti-Roman sentiment stemmed largely from personal experiences with corrupt provincial administrators who had cheated his tribe out of promised payments for military service. The chief's hatred wasn't based on ideological opposition to Roman civilization, but on practical disappointment with Roman dishonesty. This was exactly the kind of problem that Christian governance principles were designed to solve. Marcus arranged for a face-to-face meeting with Widukind under conditions that would allow both leaders to maintain their reputations regardless of the outcome. The meeting took place on a small island in the Rhine, with equal numbers of Roman and Saxon warriors providing security. Marcus came armed and armored, demonstrating that he wasn't afraid to fight if necessary. But he also brought gifts and proposals that showed his preference for peaceful solutions. The conversation that followed became legendary among both Roman and Germanic peoples, though the exact details were remembered differently by different communities. What everyone agreed on was that Marcus somehow convinced Widukind that Roman civilization under Christian influence offered opportunities for Saxon advancement that warfare could never provide. Marcus didn't try to convert Widukind to Christianity during their meeting. Instead, he focused on demonstrating how Christian principles could make Roman promises more reliable and Roman partnerships more beneficial than they had been under previous administrations. He offered Widukind's tribe not just peace, but genuine partnership in defending the frontier against other barbarian groups who might threaten both Roman and Saxon interests. But Marcus's masterstroke was his understanding of Widukind's psychological needs as a warrior leader. Instead of asking the Saxon chief to abandon his military role, Marcus offered him a position as commander of auxiliary forces that would serve Rome while maintaining their tribal identity and traditional fighting methods. This allowed Widukind to continue being a warrior while redirecting his martial talents toward purposes that served both his people's welfare and Roman security interests. The agreement Marcus negotiated with Widukind became the template for similar arrangements throughout the Germanic frontier. Instead of trying to conquer or destroy barbarian tribes, Rome began incorporating them as federal allies whose leaders maintained their authority while accepting Roman oversight and protection. These weren't puppet relationships based on Roman domination, but genuine partnerships that benefited all parties involved. The transformation of the northern frontier from a zone of constant warfare to a region of cooperative development demonstrated something that would influence European politics for centuries to come. That Christian principles could solve problems that traditional Roman methods had only perpetuated. By treating former enemies as potential partners rather than permanent threats, Marcus had created a model for expansion that was both more effective and more sustainable than conquest and occupation. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus had proven that Christian faith could enhance rather than compromise military effectiveness when properly understood and applied. His soldiers didn't fight less effectively because they showed mercy to defeated enemies. They fought more effectively because they understood their service as participation in a divine plan for human flourishing that made their sacrifices meaningful rather than merely necessary. The success of Marcus's frontier diplomacy created ripple effects that extended far beyond military and political spheres. Germanic tribes that had entered into partnership with Rome began requesting Christian missionaries to teach them about the faith that had apparently made Roman leaders more trustworthy and Roman civilization more attractive. These weren't forced conversions imposed by political pressure, but voluntary requests from people who had observed the practical benefits of Christian influence on Roman behavior. Marcus' history, the chance to spread the gospel, understood that this missionary opportunity represented something unprecedented in Christian, not through persecution and martyrdom, but through demonstration of Christian principles in action. Instead of trying to convince people to accept Christianity despite its apparent weakness, Marcus was showing them a faith that made its adherents more effective leaders, more reliable partners, and more attractive models of human flourishing. The missionaries Marcus recommended for work among the Germanic tribes were carefully chosen for their understanding of how to present Christian teaching in ways that complemented rather than threatened existing tribal values. They emphasized how Christian virtues like courage, loyalty, and justice fulfilled rather than replaced the warrior ideals that Germanic culture celebrated. They showed how Christian understanding of authority and service could enhance rather than undermine traditional tribal leadership structures. Most importantly, these missionaries demonstrated the practical benefits of Christian community life through establishing settlements that served as models of what Germanic society could become under Christian influence. These weren't isolated monasteries cut off from secular concerns, but thriving communities that combined Christian spiritual disciplines with Germanic cultural traditions in ways that produced unprecedented prosperity, security, and social harmony. The success of these missionary settlements created a feedback loop that accelerated Christian expansion throughout the barbarian world. As more Germanic tribes requested Christian teachers and began incorporating Christian principles into their governance structures, the military pressure on Roman frontiers continued to decrease while economic and cultural exchanges increased. The northern provinces that had once required massive military expenditures to defend became self-supporting regions that contributed to rather than drained imperial resources. But Marcus's achievements in transforming Roman-barbarian relations were only part of a larger revolution that was reshaping the entire imperial system. Constantine had been so impressed by the results in the northern provinces that he began implementing similar Christian governance principles throughout the empire. Tax collection became more efficient and less oppressive as officials focused on promoting economic development rather than simply extracting resources. Legal systems became fairer and more predictable as judges applied consistent moral standards rather than political considerations. Provincial administration became more effective as governors understood their roles as service rather than opportunities for personal enrichment. These changes weren't just administrative reforms. They represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of imperial authority itself. For the first time in Roman history, the empire's subjects began to see their rulers as legitimate moral authorities rather than simply superior military forces. This created a kind of loyalty and cooperation that no amount of coercion could have achieved. The cultural implications of this transformation were even more profound than the political ones. Roman civilization had always been based on the assumption that superior force created superior culture, and that conquered peoples should be grateful for the opportunity to participate in Roman greatness, regardless of how they were treated. Christian governance principles challenged these assumptions by suggesting that true cultural superiority came from moral excellence rather than military dominance, and that conquered peoples deserved respect and consideration rather than mere tolerance. This shift in cultural assumptions began attracting peoples throughout the known world who had previously seen Roman expansion as a threat to be resisted rather than an opportunity to be embraced. Envoys arrived in Rome from regions as distant as Ethiopia and India, seeking information about the principles that had apparently made Roman rule more just and attractive. These weren't military submissions forced by Roman conquest, but voluntary expressions of interest from peoples who had heard that the empire was offering something genuinely beneficial rather than merely unavoidable. Marcus found himself in the unprecedented position of serving not just as a military commander and provincial administrator, but as an international ambassador for Christian principles of governance. Delegations from across the known world sought meetings with the centurion, whose innovative methods had apparently solved problems that had plagued human civilization since the beginning of recorded history. But Marcus understood that his individual success was less important than the institutional changes that would allow Christian principles to survive and flourish, even after his own career ended. He began developing what he called Christian leadership academies, training programs that would prepare the next generation of Roman administrators to govern according to the principles that had proven so effective in his own experience. These academies weren't theological seminaries focused on abstract doctrine, but practical institutions that taught future leaders how to apply Christian virtues to the complex challenges of governing diverse populations across vast distances. Students learned not just Christian theology, but also Roman law, military strategy, economic development, and diplomatic negotiation, all integrated around the central principle that effective leadership required moral character as well as technical competence. The graduates of these academies began taking positions throughout the imperial administration, creating a network of Christian leaders whose shared principles and mutual support made the entire system more effective than the sum of its individual parts. These weren't political appointments based on religious favoritism, but merit-based selections of individuals who had demonstrated superior character and competence through rigorous training and evaluation. The success of Christian-trained administrators in solving previously intractable problems began creating a positive feedback loop that accelerated the transformation of imperial governance. As more positions were filled by leaders who understood their roles as service rather than opportunities for exploitation, the entire system became more efficient, more fair, and more attractive to subject populations who had previously viewed Roman rule as a necessary evil rather than a genuine benefit. But perhaps Marcus's most important contribution to the long-term success of Christian governance was his development of accountability mechanisms that prevented the corruption that had plagued earlier Roman administrative systems. Drawing on Christian teachings about moral responsibility and divine judgment, Marcus created review processes that held administrators accountable not just for their immediate results, but for the methods they used to achieve those results. These accountability systems weren't based on fear of punishment, but on genuine commitment to moral excellence that made corruption personally distasteful rather than merely risky. Christian administrators understood that their authority came from God rather than Caesar, and that they would ultimately answer to perfect justice for how they used whatever power they had been given. This created a level of personal integrity that external monitoring systems could never achieve. The transformation that Marcus had initiated through his individual conversion had now become an institutional revolution that was reshaping the entire Roman Empire according to Christian principles. But this was still just the beginning of a process that would ultimately transform not just Rome, but the entire trajectory of Western civilization. The principles that a converted centurion had first learned from watching Christian prisoners face death with joy and hope were now being applied to challenges of governance, diplomacy, and cultural development on a scale that no previous generation of Christians could have imagined possible. The revolution that had begun with one soldier's encounter with radical faith had become something that would reshape the world itself. And the story of how these principles continued to spread beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, influencing peoples and cultures that had never known Roman rule, reveals truths about the power of authentic faith to transform human civilization that remain just as relevant today as they were 17 centuries ago. The seeds of transformation that Marcus had planted through his faithful service as a Roman officer were beginning to grow into something that would outlast not just his own lifetime, but the empire itself, because the God he served was building a kingdom that would never end. Using the faithful service of ordinary people like Marcus to accomplish purposes that exceeded anything they could have imagined when they first chose to follow Christ rather than Caesar. But the greatest challenges to Christian governance still lay ahead, as Marcus and his fellow believers would soon discover when they faced crises that would test every aspect of their faith, their wisdom, and their commitment to serving God's purposes through the complex realities of political power in a fallen world. The true test of Marcus's revolutionary approach came not from external enemies, but from within the very heart of the empire itself. By 318 AD, the Christian transformation of Roman governance had become so successful that it triggered what historians would later call the Great Conspiracy, a coordinated effort by traditional Roman elites to destroy the new system before it could completely replace the foundations of classical civilization. The conspiracy was masterminded by Senator Gaius Valerius Maximus, but it extended far beyond senatorial politics into the deepest structures of Roman society. Pagan priesthoods who had lost their influence contributed intelligence about Christian administrators' personal weaknesses. Military officers who resented Christian promotion policies provided information about defensive vulnerabilities. Even some provincial populations who had initially benefited from Christian governance began questioning whether they really wanted to be governed by foreign religious principles, regardless of how effective those principles proved to be. The brilliance of the conspiracy lay not in its scale, but in its subtlety. Instead of launching direct attacks on Christian leaders that might create martyrs and strengthen popular support for the new system, the conspirators began a campaign of sophisticated sabotage designed to make Christian governance appear ineffective without revealing the true source of the problems. Tax revenues from key provinces began declining mysteriously as local officials loyal to the conspiracy created artificial shortages and administrative delays. Trade routes that had flourished under Christian administration suddenly became plagued by bandit attacks that seemed to evade all military countermeasures. Legal disputes that Christian judges had previously resolved quickly began dragging on for months as court clerks lost documents and witnesses disappeared. Most dangerously, The conspirators began spreading carefully crafted rumors that played on existing prejudices and fears about Christian influence. They suggested that Christian administrators were secretly sending tax revenues to foreign churches rather than imperial treasuries. They claimed that Christian military officers were deliberately weakening Roman defenses to make the empire more vulnerable to barbarian conquest. They whispered that Christian governors were planning to overthrow imperial authority entirely and establish a theocratic state controlled by bishops rather than secular leaders. These rumors were particularly effective because they contained just enough truth to seem plausible while distorting that truth beyond recognition. Christian administrators did contribute to churches, but from their personal resources rather than public funds. Christian officers did seek peaceful solutions to military conflicts, but they did so to strengthen rather than weaken Roman security. Christian governors did consult with religious leaders, but as one source of wisdom among many, rather than as ultimate authorities who superseded imperial law. Marcus recognized the conspiracy for what it was before most other Christian leaders understood the scope of the threat they were facing. His decades of military experience had taught him to recognize the patterns of coordinated deception that enemies use to weaken their targets before launching direct attacks. But he also understood that responding to the conspiracy with traditional Roman methods would destroy everything he had worked to build. The temptation was enormous. Marcus possessed detailed intelligence about the conspiracy's leadership, methods, and objectives. He could have used his network of loyal administrators to arrest the key conspirators, confiscate their property, and eliminate the threat through the kind of decisive action that Roman politics had always rewarded. A few strategic executions, some well-timed confiscations, and the conspiracy would collapse like every other challenge to imperial authority throughout Roman history. But Marcus knew that using such methods would prove his enemy's central claim, that Christian principles were ultimately incompatible with effective governance, and that Christian leaders would abandon their supposed moral convictions whenever their power was seriously threatened. If he responded to the conspiracy with traditional Roman brutality, he would validate every criticism that traditionalists had made about the impossibility of governing according to Christian standards. Instead, Marcus developed a response strategy that would either prove the superiority of Christian governance methods or destroy his entire career in spectacular fashion. Rather than attacking the conspiracy directly, he would make its existence irrelevant by demonstrating results so compelling that even the conspirators' supporters would abandon their cause. Marcus understood that the conspiracy's ultimate weakness was its dependence on sabotage rather than superior alternatives. The traditionalists could disrupt Christian governance, but they couldn't offer anything better to replace it. Their entire strategy was based on the assumption that people would prefer familiar oppression to unfamiliar justice, and that populations would choose predictable exploitation over uncertain improvement. But Marcus had learned something from his years of implementing Christian principles that his enemies hadn't understood, that people could recognize authentic service when they experienced it, and that they would support leaders who genuinely served their interests regardless of those leaders' religious beliefs or cultural backgrounds. Marcus's counter-strategy began with what he called radical transparency, a complete opening of Christian administrative processes to public scrutiny that would make sabotage obvious while demonstrating the integrity of Christian governance. Instead of conducting government business in private meetings that could be distorted by rumor and speculation, Marcus began holding public sessions where citizens could observe how decisions were made and resources allocated. Tax collection procedures were open to community oversight, with local leaders invited to verify that revenues were being calculated fairly and transmitted accurately to imperial treasuries. Military planning sessions included representatives from civilian populations who could see for themselves that defensive strategies were designed to protect rather than endanger the communities they served. Legal proceedings were conducted in full view of anyone who wanted to attend, with detailed records kept of every decision and the reasoning behind it. This transparency had multiple effects that exceeded Marcus's expectations. Citizens who had been susceptible to conspiracy rumors discovered that the reality of Christian governance was far more impressive than the distorted versions they had heard. Administrative officials who had been cooperating with the sabotage found it increasingly difficult to explain their failures when their actions were subject to public observation. Most importantly, the contrast between Christian openness and traditionalist secrecy began shifting public opinion in ways that made the conspiracy's success increasingly unlikely. But Marcus's masterstroke was his decision to invite the conspiracy's leaders to participate directly in Christian governance processes as advisors and observers, rather than trying to exclude or silence them. This wasn't naivety about their hostile intentions, but sophisticated understanding of how to neutralize opposition by making it impossible for enemies to claim they had been treated unfairly. Senator Gaius Valerius Maximus received a personal invitation from Marcus to serve on a commission evaluating the effectiveness of Christian administrative reforms. The invitation was extended publicly, with Marcus explaining that the empire would benefit from having its most experienced traditional leaders involved in assessing new approaches to governance. Maximus could hardly refuse without appearing to value political opposition over genuine concern for imperial welfare. The commission's proceedings became a public education campaign that exposed the weaknesses of traditional Roman methods while demonstrating the superiority of Christian approaches. As Maximus and his fellow traditionalists attempted to defend the old system, they found themselves explaining why corruption, brutality, and exploitation were necessary features of effective governance rather than problems that needed to be solved. Meanwhile, Christian administrators presented detailed evidence of their results. Increased tax revenues achieved through economic development rather than heavier burdens. Improved military effectiveness achieved through voluntary service rather than forced conscription. Enhanced provincial loyalty achieved through fair treatment rather than intimidation and coercion. The contrast was so stark that even Maximus began questioning whether his opposition to Christian governance was based on genuine concern for Roman welfare, or simply resistance to change that threatened his personal interests and traditional privileges. The senator who had entered the commission process as the leader of a conspiracy to destroy Christian influence found himself increasingly isolated, as his own evidence demonstrated the superiority of the system he was trying to overthrow. But the commission's most important achievement wasn't converting individual traditionalists like Maximus to support Christian governance. It was creating a public record that established Christian principles as legitimate Roman traditions rather than foreign innovations that threatened imperial stability. By showing how Christian virtues enhanced rather than replaced classical Roman values, Marcus made it impossible for future opponents to claim that Christian governance represented abandonment of Roman greatness. The collapse of the Great Conspiracy marked a turning point not just in the political struggle over Christian governance, but in the broader cultural transformation of the Roman Empire. With the failure of organized traditionalist resistance, Christian principles began spreading into areas of Roman society that had previously been untouched by religious influence. Roman law began incorporating Christian concepts of justice that emphasized restoration rather than mere punishment. Roman education started including Christian teachings about human dignity and moral responsibility alongside traditional rhetoric and philosophy. Roman art and architecture began reflecting Christian themes of service, sacrifice, and hope, rather than focusing exclusively on power, conquest, and dominance. But perhaps most significantly, Roman family life began changing as Christian principles of love, forgiveness, and mutual service replaced traditional patterns of patriarchal authority based on fear and submission. Children who grew up in Christian households learned to see authority as service rather than domination, cooperation as strength rather than weakness, and moral character as the foundation of genuine leadership rather than mere personal advantage. These changes created a generation of Romans who understood governance according to completely different assumptions than their parents and grandparents had accepted. Instead of seeing political power as an opportunity for personal enrichment, they viewed it as a responsibility to serve the common good. Instead of treating subject populations as resources to be exploited, they understood them as communities to be served and protected. Instead of measuring success through conquest and domination, they evaluated achievement through justice, mercy, and the promotion of human flourishing. The transformation was so complete that by 325 AD, when Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea to address theological disputes within the Christian community, the empire's governing class was dominated by leaders who had been trained according to Marcus's principles and methods. These weren't just nominal Christians who had converted for political advantage, but genuine believers whose understanding of faith had been shaped by seeing Christian principles successfully applied to the practical challenges of governance. But the success of Christian governance within the Roman Empire was only the beginning of a much larger story. The principles that Marcus had developed for transforming Roman administration began spreading beyond imperial borders as barbarian peoples who had entered into partnership with Rome carried Christian ideas back to their own communities and cultures. Germanic tribes that had been incorporated as federal allies began requesting Christian advisors to help them reorganize their own governance structures according to the principles they had observed working so effectively within Roman territories. Celtic communities in Britain and Gaul started adopting Christian approaches to law, economics, and social organization, even in regions that remained nominally independent of direct Roman control. Most remarkably, peoples who had never been conquered by Roman armies began sending envoys to study Christian governance methods and explore possibilities for voluntary adoption of principles that seemed to offer solutions to problems that plagued human societies everywhere. Reports reached Rome of kingdoms in Africa, India, and even distant China, where rulers were experimenting with Christian approaches to administration and diplomacy. Marcus found himself in the extraordinary position of serving as an international consultant on Christian governance to leaders throughout the known world. Delegations arrived regularly in Rome, seeking his advice on everything from tax policy to military organization to legal reform, all based on his reputation as the architect of the most successful administrative transformation in human history. But Marcus understood that his individual expertise was less important than the institutional frameworks that would allow Christian governance to survive and flourish long after his own career ended. He spent his later years developing comprehensive training programs, detailed administrative manuals, and systematic evaluation processes that could preserve and transmit the principles he had learned through decades of practical experience. The academies Marcus established for training Christian administrators became models that were replicated throughout the empire and beyond its borders. Students came from across the known world to study methods that had proven capable of solving problems that had plagued human civilization since the beginning of recorded history. These weren't just Romans seeking career advancement, but genuine seekers from every culture and background who recognized that Marcus had discovered principles with universal application. The curriculum Marcus developed integrated Christian theology with practical training in law, economics, military strategy, and diplomatic negotiation, all unified around the central insight that effective leadership required moral character as well as technical competence. Students learned not just how to govern, but why governance mattered and what ultimate purposes their authority should serve. But perhaps Marcus's greatest contribution to the long-term success of Christian governance was his recognition that institutional change without personal transformation would ultimately fail. He insisted that his students begin with their own spiritual formation, understanding their relationship with God and their responsibilities to serve divine purposes through whatever earthly authority they might exercise. This emphasis on personal formation created leaders who governed not just according to Christian principles, but from Christian motivations. They weren't simply applying techniques that had proven effective, but expressing faith commitments that shaped their understanding of success, failure, and ultimate purpose. This made Christian governance resilient in ways that purely institutional reforms could never achieve. The network of leaders trained according to Marcus's principles began creating what historians would later recognize as the foundation of medieval Christendom, a civilization that attempted to organize all aspects of human society around Christian understanding of truth, justice, and human flourishing. This wasn't the result of imperial conquest or ecclesiastical control, but of voluntary adoption by peoples who had observed the practical benefits of Christian governance and chosen to embrace principles that enhanced, rather than threatened, their own cultural traditions. The transformation that had begun with one Roman soldier's encounter with Christian prisoners in a distant fortress had become something that reshaped not just the empire, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. The principles that Marcus had learned from watching believers face death with joy and hope were now being applied to challenges of governance, economics, education, and social organization on a scale that exceeded anything previous generations of Christians could have imagined possible. But Marcus understood that his greatest achievement wasn't the institutional changes he had implemented, or even the international influence his methods had achieved. His greatest success was demonstrating that Christian faith could transform not just individual hearts, but entire civilizations, not through force or manipulation, but through the attractive power of authentic virtue expressed in practical service to human needs. The centurion who had once wondered whether he could serve both Christ and Caesar had discovered that the question itself was based on false assumptions. When properly understood, serving Christ meant becoming more effective at serving legitimate human authority, and serving human authority faithfully meant participating in God's purposes for human flourishing and social justice. Marcus had proven that the gospel wasn't just good news for individuals seeking personal salvation, but good news for entire civilizations seeking solutions to the fundamental problems of human organization and cooperation. The same faith that transformed personal character could also transform political institutions, economic systems, and social relationships in ways that benefited everyone regardless of their particular religious beliefs. But the story of Marcus's influence on the Roman Empire was still just the beginning of a much larger narrative about how Christian faith continued to spread throughout the known world, carrying principles of governance and social organization that would shape human civilization for centuries to come. The revolution that had begun in a prison cell had become something that would ultimately reach every corner of the earth, transforming not just individual lives, but entire cultures according to the vision of human dignity and divine purpose that Christ himself had proclaimed. And as Marcus grew older, watching the fruits of his faithful service multiply beyond anything he could have anticipated when he first chose to follow Christ rather than the traditional gods of Rome, he understood that he had been privileged to participate in something far greater than his own career, or even his own lifetime. He had been part of God's plan to transform the world itself, using the faithful obedience of ordinary people like himself to accomplish purposes that exceeded anything purely human wisdom could have conceived or achieved. The soldier who had once carried a sword in service of Caesar's empire had become something far more significant, an instrument in the hands of the King of Kings, used to advance a kingdom that would never end and establish principles of justice and mercy that would outlast every earthly power. His faith had indeed sparked conversions across an empire, but more than that, it had demonstrated the power of authentic Christianity to transform not just hearts, but entire civilizations according to God's purposes for human flourishing. The transformation Marcus had witnessed was extraordinary, but it was about to accelerate beyond anything even he could have imagined. Because by 325 AD, something unprecedented was happening throughout the known world. Christian principles weren't just changing how Romans governed their empire. They were creating entirely new models of civilization that peoples across 3 continents were voluntarily adopting and adapting to their own cultural contexts. Picture this. In the mountains of Armenia, Tribal chieftains who had never seen a Roman legion were reorganizing their warrior societies according to principles they had learned from Christian merchants traveling the Silk Roads. In the kingdoms of Nubia, rulers were discovering that Christian approaches to justice and administration produced more stable and prosperous societies than the traditional methods they had inherited from their ancestors. Even in distant Ireland, Celtic Druids were finding that Christian teachings about authority and service enhanced, rather than threatened, their own cultural wisdom about leadership and community. But here's what makes this expansion so remarkable. It wasn't happening through military conquest or political coercion. It was spreading through what we might call conversion by attraction, people choosing to adopt Christian governance principles because they had observed their practical effectiveness in solving real problems that plagued human societies everywhere. Marcus began receiving reports that seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. Kingdoms that had been torn apart by tribal warfare for generations were achieving lasting peace through Christian approaches to conflict resolution. Societies that had struggled with chronic poverty were experiencing unprecedented economic development through Christian principles of stewardship and mutual service. Communities that had been fractured by class divisions and ethnic tensions were finding unity through Christian understanding of human dignity and universal brotherhood. The mechanics of this expansion reveal something profound about how authentic transformation actually spreads through human civilizations. It wasn't missionaries preaching abstract theology that created these changes. It was practical administrators, military officers, merchants, and craftsmen who had learned to apply Christian principles to their daily work and were achieving results that impressed everyone who witnessed them. Consider what happened in the kingdom of Aksum, in what is now Ethiopia. King Ezana had initially been skeptical of reports about Christian governance methods, viewing them as foreign innovations that might threaten his traditional authority. But when Aksumite merchants returned from trading expeditions to Roman territories with detailed accounts of the prosperity and stability they had observed under Christian administration, Ezana decided to conduct his own experiment. The king appointed a group of advisors who had studied Christian principles to implement reforms in one troubled province that had been plagued by chronic rebellion and economic stagnation. Within 2 years, that province had become the most peaceful and prosperous region of his kingdom. Tax revenues increased dramatically, not through heavier burdens, but through expanded economic activity. Military costs plummeted as former rebels became productive citizens. Most remarkably, neighboring provinces began requesting similar reforms. King Ezana's experience was being replicated by rulers throughout Africa, Asia, and even beyond the traditional boundaries of the civilized world. Christian principles of governance weren't just working within Roman cultural contexts. They were proving effective across every cultural and linguistic barrier, suggesting that Marcus had discovered something truly universal about human nature and social organization. But the expansion wasn't limited to governmental applications. Christian principles were transforming commerce, education, family relationships, and even artistic expression in ways that created what historians would later recognize as the first truly international civilization in human history. Christian merchants developed trading practices based on honesty, fair dealing, and mutual benefit, rather than the traditional approach of maximizing profit through deception and exploitation. These methods proved so successful that even pagan traders began adopting Christian commercial ethics, because they produced better long-term results than traditional approaches. Christian educators created schools that emphasized character development alongside intellectual training, producing graduates who were not only more knowledgeable, but more trustworthy and effective leaders. These educational innovations attracted students from across the known world, spreading Christian influence through the most talented and ambitious young people of every culture. Christian families demonstrated relationships based on love, forgiveness, and mutual service, rather than fear, manipulation, and domination. These family patterns produced children who grew up understanding authority as service rather than oppression, making them naturally suited for leadership roles that required genuine moral character. Even Christian artistic expression began influencing cultural development in regions that had never experienced direct Christian teaching. Architecture, sculpture, music, and literature that reflected Christian themes of hope, redemption, and human dignity proved more inspiring and emotionally satisfying than traditional art forms focused exclusively on power, conquest, and worldly success. Marcus found himself documenting a phenomenon that exceeded anything recorded in previous human history: the voluntary adoption of a comprehensive worldview by diverse peoples who had never been conquered, coerced, or even directly evangelized. Christian principles were spreading through their own attractive power, drawing people who recognized that these ideas offered solutions to problems that no other philosophy or religion had successfully addressed. But Marcus also began noticing something that would prove crucial for the long-term success of Christian civilization: the adaptation process that occurred as different cultures embraced Christian principles while maintaining their own distinctive identities and traditions. Germanic tribes that adopted Christian governance didn't abandon their warrior culture. Instead, they redirected their martial virtues toward protecting the innocent and serving justice rather than pursuing conquest and plunder. Their courage, loyalty, and discipline remained intact, but these qualities now served Christian purposes rather than purely tribal interests. Celtic communities that embraced Christian principles didn't eliminate their deep connection to nature and their sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships. Instead, they began seeing the natural world as God's creation that deserved careful stewardship, rather than simply a resource to be exploited for human advantage. Greek intellectuals who encountered Christian teaching didn't abandon their love of philosophical inquiry and rational analysis. Instead, they discovered that Christian revelation provided a foundation for understanding reality that made their intellectual pursuits more rather than less satisfying and meaningful. This pattern of cultural enhancement rather than cultural replacement became one of the most powerful factors in Christianity's continued expansion. Peoples throughout the known world discovered that Christian faith didn't threaten their cultural identity, but fulfilled it, bringing out the best aspects of their traditions while providing solutions to the problems that their traditional approaches couldn't solve. Marcus began developing what he called cultural synthesis protocols, systematic methods for helping different peoples understand how Christian principles could enhance rather than replace their existing cultural strengths. These protocols became essential tools for the Christian administrators, missionaries, and teachers who were carrying the faith to every corner of the civilized world. The protocols began with careful study of each culture's existing values, traditions, and social structures. Instead of condemning everything that wasn't explicitly Christian, Marcus taught his students to look for elements within each culture that reflected universal truths about human nature and divine purpose. These elements could serve as bridges for introducing Christian understanding without requiring people to abandon everything that made their culture distinctive. For example, when working with nomadic peoples who valued courage and hospitality, Christian teachers would emphasize how these virtues reflected God's character and could be perfected through Christian understanding of service and sacrifice. When engaging with agricultural communities that celebrated the cycles of planting and harvest, Christian educators would show how these natural rhythms reflected spiritual truths about death, resurrection, and eternal life. The genius of this approach was that it allowed Christian principles to take root within existing cultural frameworks, rather than requiring complete cultural transformation as a prerequisite for spiritual understanding. People could begin living according to Christian values while still maintaining their cultural identity, and they often discovered that Christian faith made them better representatives of their own traditions rather than forcing them to become imitations of Roman or Greek Christians. But Marcus's most important insight was recognizing that this cultural adaptation process enriched Christianity itself rather than weakening it. Each culture that embraced Christian principles brought unique perspectives and insights that enhanced the global Christian community's understanding of God's character and purposes. Germanic Christians contributed insights about loyalty and sacrifice that helped other Christians understand the depth of Christ's commitment to his followers. Celtic Christians brought wisdom about creation and stewardship that enriched Christian thinking about environmental responsibility and the relationship between spiritual and physical reality. Greek Christians offered intellectual frameworks that helped the global church articulate its beliefs more precisely and communicate them more effectively to educated audiences. The result was a Christianity that was simultaneously universal and particular, universal in its core principles and particular in its cultural expressions. This combination proved irresistible to peoples throughout the known world who were searching for truth that transcended their local limitations, while still honoring their distinctive cultural contributions to human civilization. By 330 AD, when Constantine established his new capital at Constantinople, the Christian transformation of the Roman Empire had become the foundation for something far more ambitious: the creation of what historians would later call the first truly global civilization in human history. Christian principles were providing common ground for cooperation between peoples who had previously viewed each other as irredeemable enemies or incomprehensible foreigners. Trade networks expanded dramatically as Christian merchants from different cultures discovered they could trust each other to honor agreements and treat trading partners fairly. Diplomatic relationships improved as Christian rulers found they could negotiate lasting agreements based on shared moral commitments rather than temporary balances of power. Cultural exchanges flourished as Christian scholars, artists, and craftsmen shared techniques and insights across traditional ethnic and linguistic boundaries. Marcus watched these developments with a sense of awe that never diminished, even as the scope of Christian influence continued to expand beyond anything he could have anticipated when he first encountered Caius in that prison cell. The faith that had transformed his own understanding of courage, discipline, and loyalty was now transforming entire civilizations according to the same principles. But Marcus also understood that success on this scale created new challenges that would test every aspect of Christian character and wisdom. How do you maintain spiritual authenticity when your faith becomes associated with political power and social prestige? How do you preserve the radical nature of Christian love when Christian principles become conventional wisdom that everyone claims to embrace? How do you continue growing in grace and truth when the entire world seems to be adopting your values and methods? These weren't abstract theological questions for Marcus. They were practical challenges that he faced daily as he worked with Christian leaders throughout the empire who were struggling to maintain their spiritual integrity while exercising unprecedented levels of political and cultural influence. Some Christian administrators were beginning to show signs of spiritual pride, taking personal credit for achievements that Marcus knew were the result of God's blessing on faithful service rather than human wisdom or competence. Other Christian leaders were becoming complacent, assuming that institutional success guaranteed spiritual health and that political influence could substitute for personal transformation. Most dangerously, some Christian teachers were beginning to compromise essential aspects of Christian teaching in order to make the faith more acceptable to powerful people who wanted the practical benefits of Christian governance without the spiritual demands of Christian discipleship. Marcus recognized these as the same temptations that had corrupted earlier religious and philosophical movements throughout history. Success bred arrogance, influence bred compromise, and institutional power bred spiritual decay unless carefully guarded by leaders who understood that earthly achievements were valuable only insofar as they served eternal purposes. His response to these challenges revealed why Marcus had been such an effective instrument for Christian expansion. Instead of becoming defensive about criticism or protective of his achievements, Marcus began implementing what he called spiritual accountability systems designed to help Christian leaders maintain their spiritual focus, even as their temporal influence continued to expand. These systems began with regular spiritual retreats where Christian administrators could step away from their responsibilities to focus on prayer, study, and personal examination without the pressures and distractions of daily governance. Marcus understood that leaders who were constantly making decisions about other people's welfare needed regular opportunities to evaluate their own spiritual condition and recommit themselves to the principles that had made their service effective. The retreats weren't escapes from responsibility, but intensive preparation for more faithful service. Participants studied scripture, examined their motivations, confessed their failures, and received encouragement and correction from spiritual mentors who understood the unique challenges of exercising authority according to Christian principles. But Marcus's most innovative contribution was creating what he called reverse mentoring relationships, where established Christian leaders regularly sought guidance from newer converts, whose spiritual enthusiasm hadn't been dulled by familiarity with success. These relationships prevented the spiritual stagnation that often affected people who had been in leadership positions for extended periods. Marcus himself maintained friendships with recent converts from every cultural background, learning from their fresh perspectives on Christian teaching and their insights about how the gospel addressed problems he had grown accustomed to accepting as inevitable. These relationships kept Marcus spiritually sharp and culturally aware in ways that prevented him from becoming isolated within circles of established Christian leadership. The accountability systems Marcus developed became standard practice throughout the expanding Christian world, creating a culture of spiritual vigilance that helped preserve the authenticity and effectiveness of Christian governance, even as it spread to unprecedented levels of political and social influence. But perhaps Marcus's most important contribution during this period was his recognition that the ultimate test of Christian civilization wouldn't be its external success, but its ability to maintain the spiritual vitality that had made that success possible in the first place. Institutional Christianity needed to remain conversion Christianity, a faith that continued transforming hearts and minds rather than simply managing social and political structures. This insight led Marcus to invest increasing amounts of his time and energy in developing what he called evangelical administration, approaches to governance that made the transforming power of the gospel visible through the daily operations of Christian institutions. Citizens who interacted with Christian governments should experience something that pointed them toward the spiritual realities that made such governance possible. Tax collectors should demonstrate honesty and compassion that reflected God's character. Military officers should display courage and justice that revealed divine purposes for human authority. Judges should embody wisdom and mercy that pointed toward ultimate accountability to perfect justice. Every aspect of Christian governance should serve not just practical needs, but evangelical purposes that drew people toward personal relationship with Christ. This evangelical dimension of Christian administration proved crucial for maintaining the spiritual momentum that had driven Christianity's initial expansion. As Christian governance became more successful and widespread, it continued attracting people who were drawn not just by its practical effectiveness, but by its spiritual authenticity and transforming power. The combination of institutional success and spiritual vitality created a positive feedback loop that sustained Christian expansion even as it reached peoples and cultures that were increasingly distant from the original centers of Christian development. Each new community that embraced Christian principles added its own insights and contributions to the growing global Christian civilization, while maintaining the spiritual authenticity that made such contributions possible. By 335 AD, Marcus could look back on nearly a quarter century of service and see that his individual conversion had indeed become part of something far greater than anything he could have imagined when he first chose to follow Christ, rather than the traditional gods of Rome. The transformation that had begun in his own heart had spread throughout the empire and beyond, creating new possibilities for human civilization. that exceeded the dreams of philosophers and the ambitions of conquerors. But Marcus also understood that his story was just one thread in a tapestry that God was weaving through the faithful service of countless believers who had chosen to serve Christ through whatever opportunities and responsibilities they had been given. The centurion, who had wondered whether he could serve both Christ and Caesar, had discovered that the question itself had been based on false assumptions about the nature of divine sovereignty and human authority. When properly understood, serving Christ meant becoming more effective at serving legitimate human needs and purposes. And serving human authority faithfully meant participating in God's larger purposes for human flourishing and social justice. The same faith that transformed individual character could also transform entire civilizations when applied with wisdom, courage, and persistent faithfulness to the principles Christ had taught and demonstrated. Marcus had learned that conversion wasn't just a personal experience that affected individual destiny. It was a social and political force that could reshape the entire trajectory of human history when believers understood their faith as a comprehensive worldview that applied to every aspect of human existence rather than simply a private religious preference that had no bearing on public life. The revolution that had begun with one Roman soldier's encounter with Christian prisoners had become something that would continue spreading throughout the world, carrying principles of governance, economics, education, and social organization that reflected God's character and served God's purposes for human civilization. And Marcus knew that this was still just the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately reach every nation and culture on earth, as Christ himself had promised when he commissioned his followers to make disciples of all peoples. The soldier's faith had indeed sparked conversions across an empire, but more than that, it had demonstrated the power of authentic Christianity to transform not just individual hearts, but entire civilizations according to God's vision for human flourishing and divine glory. And that transformation would continue long after Marcus himself had finished his earthly service, carried forward by the countless believers who had learned from his example that faithful service to Christ could indeed change the world. And there you have it. The incredible story of how one Roman soldier's encounter with radical faith didn't just change his own destiny, but sparked a revolution that transformed an entire empire and reshaped the course of human civilization. Marcus Flavius Antonius proved that when authentic faith meets strategic wisdom, when spiritual conviction combines with practical competence, the results can exceed anything we might imagine possible. His legacy reminds us that conversion isn't just a personal experience, but a transformative force that can change not just hearts, but entire cultures, when we have the courage to live out our deepest convictions in whatever sphere of influence we've been given.